Sullivan. I'm the founder of the Women's Coach. I provide coaching to women who are going through some kind of life transition, whether it's a lot of my clients that I work with are pursuing second careers, and there's this nagging feeling that there's something more waiting for them in life. And the fun thing that I use in my coaching is astrology. I use it as an intuitive tool. And I tell people that who ask, well, how did you get into astrology? That it found me just a few years ago, actually. There was the Great American Eclipse, and I found myself going through what had probably been 10 years of pivoting in my own career and asking a lot of questions around what am I really here to do? And the answers came to me through astrology and during the eclipse. And so I opened my practice this year. And the other piece of my background and career is that I was a lawyer for 20 years in the nonprofit sector. So I'm very much, my passion and belief is that we all have a voice and we need to use it. And so I spent about 15 years doing that in the environmental public interest arena. And now I've transferred that to working with women to step into their power and their voice. So I always have been a little bit of a round peg in a square hole. I remember very distinctly in law school, I took the Myers-Briggs personality assessment my first year, and it basically told me that I was one of the most uncommon lawyer types. But I was very service driven. I've always been very interested in people and their stories, and I will also answer how I got into it. Now looking back, one of the powers for me in astrology is it helped me understand my life story, and that's what I use it as a mirror, a compassionate mirror for women to really understand themselves in a way that they haven't been able to before, and to see how all the pieces fit. So I knew about 10 years after practicing law that it had become much more of an intellectual exercise than I wanted, that I was growing and evolving. I had 2 children. I became a mom in my early 30s, and I was really wanting to connect more from that relational space. And so the last 5 years of my career as a lawyer, I went and I worked in an association where it was actually the most highly creative time in my profession, and I really understood the strength that I had in helping people see opportunities and leveraging those opportunities to help people advance, their mission and their agenda, and that's what really ignited me and turned me on. So after 5 years of doing that, I'd always been fairly, without knowing it, I think an entrepreneur. Like I just really, I really had a hard time taking orders from other people. I have very strong views and opinions. So in that respect, probably not an uncommon lawyer. And so I decided to start out on my own and do some consulting. So it was I would say a very gradual process. I went away from the actual practice of law, and then I went into something that allowed me to work more with people relationally. And then I spent 5 years actually doing consulting back to nonprofits in the arena of advocacy. So it was a very niche area, and it was hard to figure out the business model for that. Nonprofits, unfortunately, are always cash strapped, and it was a real learning process for me during those 5 years, because I can be very headstrong and not sometimes see the forest for the trees. And there were a lot of things. I did a lot of training. I really enjoyed educating and training. And so, and then at the very end of that, I started doing coaching to nonprofit executives. And I realized this is really what I wanted to do. Now, even knowing that though, I was still very much identified as a lawyer. So I am now much more comfortable sharing what I do, but I will be totally honest with you and say that it is still something that I'm integrating within myself. I love astrology. I think it's super powerful, but I think anytime we make a change in our life, I do think it's a pretty big change as well. We're going to go through some evolution and some growth. And so I knew I wanted to be a coach. Then we had the Great American Eclipse. I literally sort of stumbled into a lecture on astrology, and I realized that my North Node, which is a very karmic point in your chart that shows you your life purpose, what you're here to do, that it was being activated by this eclipse. at the very same time that within myself, I was being activated and asking these questions around why I was here and what I was here to do. So it was kind of this perfect alignment. And I decided to start to understand my own chart. And it was kind of like learning a second language really easily, but much more quickly than I ever picked up French. And I realized that it actually fed the very analytical part of my, the lawyer part of me. And to me, it became like collecting, it was almost like building your case, is what I said to people. It was like I could see the points in the chart, and I could see your relationship patterns. I could see your relationship with your parents. I could see your career trajectory, your challenges with money. Just things just started to jump off for me. And I started to use it with friends and family. And then I had many people, after I'd done readings for them, encouraged me to use it. And so now I use it in my practice. Well, it's an answer that people don't usually like. And that is to become really still and to do less, to build into your day a period of stillness and reflection. Because if you are on autopilot, the answers aren't going to come to you. And for me, I went from being a single mother. So I went through a divorce about 9 years ago. And then I met my husband. And then I started a business and I got married. And so there was like a whole lot of change in a short amount of time. And right at the time I started my business, I realized like I had really sort of, I had gone through this transition phase where I had sort of reintegrated myself and got very clear in terms of who I was. And then I went through this whole other transition. So for me, part of, when you ask how can people get clear on that, I think for one thing, if you are going through any kind of change, whether it's a change that you voluntarily took on or that happened to you, give yourself time and space to reflect on that. So that's one thing, because I know, for instance, I'm kind of a change junkie. I'll sort of admit that. Like I thrive off a lot of variety and difference, and that's good to a degree. And looking back, I can realize like I went too quickly from leaving my job to getting married to starting my own business. Like that was a lot. And so then I spent probably a good portion of that time that I had started my own business really trying to understand who I had just become with this new identity. I was suddenly a stepmother. We had 5 children from, age of 10 to 17. Like life was very busy and full. And then I was trying to start a business. And so my first word of advice is slow down and give yourself time to reflect. To build into your routine every day a moment, I know that meditation can be really hard for like fast-paced women, but whatever we call that, those 5 or 10 minutes at the beginning or end of your day, to just give yourself that time. And there doesn't need to be profound realizations that come to you. It's literally just a chance to actually connect with yourself and to quiet the thoughts. So I've gotten to a point in my life where that listening is just something I'm doing all the time, but it wasn't that way at all. And it took this process of sort of starting and stopping and going through extreme periods of stress and anxiety to realize that isn't a good way to live. So I think my best advice to people is to try to adjust your life so that you're doing less and slowing down. And it is possible, even for the busiest person, but it's all a matter of, so the other piece is, do we value ourselves enough, right? And so it's really looking at that as a gift you're giving yourself, and an investment in your own self-awareness and mindfulness, and overall, I would say quality of life. And then of course, but I think this is a really important first step, because if we're not quiet and still within ourselves, we're not gonna have any sense of direction. And then beyond that, obviously, there's books you can read and you can start to look outside of yourself. But I think when we're confused and jumbled and not centered in ourselves, and then we start to look outside and go on the internet or read books or talk to friends or something, that's when I think it can get very confusing. And then of course you can always, work with a coach or an advisor or do something a little more formal if you've reached this realization of I'm feeling stuck and there's something different and I don't quite know what it is, but I'm trusting that voice and that feeling inside myself enough to act on it. I think we are so programmed to be in our heads 24/7, especially in this for us as women, that being alienated from what we desire from our heart, from our emotional center, is just really sucks the life out of us. I don't know what better way to say it. And it's epidemic and it's chronic, and we don't even know we're doing it. And so part of what I think is very powerful about any kind of practice that you might have on a regular basis, if it's meditation or spiritual, whatever, it's just reconnecting that pathway between, because we need both, and we need the heart center even more. So that's, I guess, an outcome of the stillness is to make that connection, that circuitry, so that you are really connecting with your desire. Because I guarantee you, if women can connect with what they want, the change becomes so much easier. But the vast majority of the clients that I work with, who right now I work with women from their 30s to their mid 50s, and I see that as a range. On the younger end, they tend to be women who I would say are fairly ambitious and have defined themselves a certain way, and get into the career world and realize that a lot of that was, as it is for most of us, conditioned into them, and they didn't really know who they were or what they wanted. And so I think we all have our awakenings at different stages. And then I have on the other end a lot of women whose children are grown and have gone out of the house, and then they get their stillness. And they have that opportunity. But I think for everyone, it is having those moments of awareness enough, get louder and louder, that they're prompted to work. So it just kind of depends on, again, I think a lot of it is driven by circumstances in our life in question. Because if I think about even my own journey, the things that I realize now that it's taken me to the middle of my 40s. And again, this was one of the powers of looking at my chart. It's like I knew I had very strong intuition, and that was getting louder and louder as I got older. But then when I looked at my chart, it was very validating in terms of some of the gifts, which again, I think is one of the powers of astrology. And there are very clear markers that can show us that. I think that our whole culture, it's Western culture, right? That I live with right now, and have always tended to live. I've had more brothers, I've had more sons. So men, and, I think part of it is teaching men too to honor their intuition, because if it's not black and white and you can't prove it to me, they're like, very skeptical. And I think that's a big lift, because that's our Western based culture. So, but again, I think that's also changing, and it'll change through women. It's going to change through women leaning into that conversation around in listening to our intuitive voice. It is the reason that I ended up doing what I'm doing. But I will say to you that it has been a huge journey. And I think as women too, one of our traps is we, fall into comparisonitis. And so, especially with the internet, and I'm not, for better or for worse, I'm not somebody who follows a lot of people, and probably because I know that about myself, because it's been a journey to my own sense of security and self, really being grounded in that self-worth. But I wish that, well, no, I don't believe in regrets or changing anything, but I've always had a very strong intuition. There was just a lot of an equally strong sense of self-doubt on the other side of that. And I wish that somehow earlier in my life, there had been someone or something that had seen that and brought it forward more. I absolutely believe that we have the journey, and everything in life happens absolutely as it's intended. So I don't want to say that in terms of, again, any kind of regrets, but there's so much pain in feeling like you're somehow blocked from who you are really meant to be. And when we are conditioned to feel like we need to. I was just very conditioned and driven to want to achieve, but that can keep us stuck. And so when we can't give ourselves permission to see ourselves in a different way and to shift that identity, I think the question of identity is another really big one. But and and the more that we can kind of lean into trusting our intuition, I think that allows us to be able to really bring forth all of our gifts. And so um, I don't know if that's something that I yeah, that I think now, sitting where I sit, I have that perspective. Um, but when you're in it, it can sometimes be very uh, isolating, or you can feel very isolated when you're sort of in between these two places. A lot of my life, and all of us come into the world with different journeys, but so much of my life has been fighting against myself that I wish that I could have spent less of it doing that. But that's where the growth comes from. And I'm a very big believer. This is another theme of the work that I do, but that we all get second chances. We all have one life, but we have second chances over and over and over again. And I've certainly experienced those, and the power of starting over. It's really a gift. Uh, and I think that's also where the self-compassion comes in, because I think as women, we have to get still, but then we also have to give ourselves that permission and that gift of starting over, whether it's in our career or relationship or whatever aspect of our life. I think the ability to open up to your intuition and to allow yourself the chance, or the second chances in life, it does require compassion, but also one of the biggest barriers that I find with the women that I coach is just judgment, just self-judgment. And that's actually where also astrology can be really useful, because we can look at the patterns. I mean, the powerful thing about the charts that I look at, I tend to not I use astrology to look from an evolutionary perspective, like why are we here and where are we going, instead of like predictively. And so we can look at the patterns and find out how they judge themselves or why they judge themselves. And then we can also kind of see the pathway out of those judgments. And that is one of the biggest barriers that prevents women from really giving themselves the permission to become who they are meant to be.